Good morning, everyone. I want to, first of all, just begin by thanking you all for allowing your curiosity, I assume, to lure you here. We're engaged in a project of mythic proportion, I would say, as Bruce was just alluding to. We're trying to usher in a new story of what it is to be a human being and our place in this universe, and that's a collaborative effort. Bruce and I started collaborating about 6 years ago. We were invited by an artist, a benefactor of some artists who wanted to inspire these artists with some big picture ideas about the origin of life, and my own background in process philosophy, which I'll explain in a little bit. And this was in the BC era, as I call it, before COVID. This was back in 2019. And I think actually the pandemic is a good illustration of the dangers of a certain kind of anthropocentrism. It was a microbe, very tiny little virus that shut down the entirety of our civilization for a little while there. And that then led to all sorts of social and political discord in the aftermath, right? And so, lest we imagine that as powerful as we are, and we do live in the Anthropocene now, where the human being, particularly in our industrial form of presence on this earth, we're a geological force, it's true, but we're also quite fragile as individuals and as a civilization. And I think the COVID pandemic brought that home. So what I want to try to share with you all is certainly building on many of the threads we heard earlier this morning from Brian and Jude and Mary Evelyn about the role of the human being and how we can avoid a kind of crass anthropocentrism at the same time that we avoid what you could think of as the opposite extreme, a kind of crude anthropomorphism. There's a way in which one way of getting out of the anthropocentric perspective, where we imagine that all meaning and value and consciousness in the universe is sequestered inside human skulls, is to re-inhabit a kind of animist universe, which the pre-scientific world, every culture on every continent, had an animistic understanding of the natural world, which is to say that consciousness is not just in human skulls, it's out there in nature. It's in the sun, in the stars, and all of the plants, and even the rocks, and of course the other animals. And modern science and anthropology and whatnot tended to imagine in a kind of conceited way that, we modern scientific people now know that, the sun's a ball of gas and rocks are just, crystals of atoms, and that, the natural world is more or less dead, right? And I think rather than imagining and projecting really a kind of mechanistic image onto the cosmos, I think we can recover this animist view, and I think that the story of cosmogenesis that we heard this morning and Bruce's account of biogenesis can help us imagine that, what we call matter isn't actually just dead stuff. And that there's a risk, of course, in recovering this animist view that we become too anthropomorphic. But I think there's a tension to be held there and a balance to be struck, and it's actually worth the risk. In fact, our survival as a species and the survival of many other species may depend upon finding the right balance and holding the tension here. So, Bruce is describing a paradigm shift within a special science, within biology, and even a sub-discipline within biology, the study of the origin of life. And it's momentous to witness this happening in real time. I mean, when Bruce and I first started talking 6 years ago, he's just getting these papers published in the journals and causing the disruption, and the scientists are fighting. And now here we are, 6 years later, and it says that this paradigm shift is now well underway. And Bruce and I, he's a scientist, now a philosopher, we've reflected looking at prior epochs in the history of science on the way that during these paradigm shifts, all of a sudden, philosophers and scientists can collaborate in a deeper and richer way. I'm very interested in metaphysics, and if you go into a Barnes and Noble or something, the metaphysics section is about crystal healing, and you can get some incense and tarot cards and whatever, and that stuff's interesting. But metaphysics, in the traditional sense, is not so much about adding extra special sauce to our picture of the physical world, but it's more about exploring, for example, what are the conditions that make science itself possible? What is it in the nature of things such that there should be science? What kind of universe do we live in such that conscious agents and interested in the truth should have emerged? That's a metaphysical question. And so in this turmoil of a paradigm shift, I was very interested in Bruce's work because of the cosmological implications of it, right? And cosmology is the study of the large-scale structure and dynamics of the universe, but it's also traditionally the study of how human beings make meaning or tell stories or develop myths to help us orient ourselves amidst those large-scale dynamics, right? And in the modern period, science, in a way, for some good reasons, severed the value dimension, the subjective dimension, the mind dimension, from the material, the factual, the measurable, so that it could go about understanding the natural world. And a lot of brilliant discoveries came out of that work. But our task now is to bring these back together and to recognize that science and myth, and we could even say science and religion in a broad sense, are not at odds with each other. And in some sense, science is not the opposite of myth. It comes out of myth and presupposes myth, right? Science is a cultural activity. Science is interested in the truth. It values the truth. Where does that value come from, right? Well, there's a whole long cultural history that preceded modern science that gave us an understanding of why the truth should even be worth knowing and pursuing, right? And so part of the invitation here is to, again, hold that tension between the fear of anthropomorphism and the risks of anthropocentrism, so we can find a way forward here to tell a meaningful story rooted in the scientific evidence that can help us replant our civilization in the planet out of which we originated. I think we've kind of lost the plot as a civilization. And it's not that, our social and political and cultural disputes are not often very important, but there's a larger context that we have totally forgotten about that I think could help inform the ways that we try to resolve some of those conflicts. And, from a cosmological perspective, I think this paradigm shift within astrobiology and abiogenesis, the study of the origin of life, is an important indicator for a much larger shift that's not at the level of just a paradigm within a special science, but is at the level of, I think, really the cosmological revolution that Copernicus brought about, where actually recovering some ancient Greek ideas about a sun-centric solar system, Copernicus helps to usher in a totally new worldview to guide a totally new type of civilization, right? We had been imagining that the Earth was the still center of a universe, which was quite tiny in comparison to the trillion galaxies that Brian was introducing us to. And the moon and the sun and the other planets orbit around the Earth, right? In these crystalline spheres, right? And then the fixed stars are sort of the edge of the universe, and beyond that is the divine, right? And Copernicus had a spiritual motivation, actually, to put the sun back at the center. And initially, Copernicus's move here was an elevation of the human being in the sense that he recognized that it took human intellect and imagination and mathematical prowess to put oneself into the sun, to take the sun's perspective on the solar system rather than just the Earth's perspective, right? And so the point here is, while we got to hear about Bruce living through this paradigm shift in the life sciences, I think we're all also living through a cosmological revolution at the level of how we understand our place in a universe that's coming back to life from our perspective. It's been alive the whole time, but we forgot that. We've become distracted from that living context, right, that can inform us. So one of the issues with the study of the origin of life that I'm very interested in as a philosopher is, before we can understand how life may have originated, we need a definition of life. What is life? And that's not a trivial matter. There are a lot of debates. It's often debates among philosophers of biology who aren't in there, studying the molecules and getting up close, trying to see particular processes at work. Philosophers of biology are interested in definitions, right? And so there have been various proposals. Life is the type of thing that you kind of know it when you see it, but there are all these edge cases where we're not quite sure. Is a virus alive, for example? Well, it needs to hijack a living cell in order to reproduce itself, and outside of that context, it kind of just sits there and is just an inert molecule. And so part of what excites me so much about Bruce's work, getting into the details of the wet-dry cycling and the formation of these longer polymers in a form of evolutionary selection before you even have genomes, that it's really pointing us to a realization about the relationship between what we call the biological world, biological organisms, biological cells, and what we used to think of as the non-living material world. There's no gap here between atoms and molecules, chemical activity, and then living beings. There's a story we need to tell, a theory we need to devise that would allow us to account for all of the minute little processes which need to occur to give us what we recognize as the agency and the intelligence and the interiority of living beings. But there's no gap, right? And so rather than thinking of life as something completely and utterly new in the universe that comes out of what before the emergence of life was just dead stuff banging into itself, we can see that there's actually a gradient here. There's a spectrum here of vitality that goes all the way back to the big breath at the origins of matter and energy in space and time. The universe is pervaded by what word to use. I don't necessarily want to say life. Maybe we can reserve that for the biological sciences. We could say it's pervaded by creativity, perhaps, which, maybe a century ago was a term that we would reserve for just, human psychology. It's human beings have this creative genius, this capacity to produce novelty. But one of my favorite philosophers, Alfred North Whitehead, started to apply this term creativity to the cosmos at large. And I think it's a good term for understanding the vitality, say, of the material world that even allows for something more complex like cellular life to emerge later on. But in some sense, when we're asking about the origin of life, we're also implicitly asking about the origin of matter. And in fact, as Bruce knows, Darwin in some of his letters, he was really focused on understanding the process of speciation. And for Darwin, the origin of life was just such a difficult question to even begin inquiring into that he said, well, we may as well ask about the origin of matter, just as a kind of offhand joke. But I really do think that to understand the origin of life, behind that question is this other question: what is the origin of matter, the origin of matter and energy in the universe? But also, implicit in this question is, what is the origin of mind? Because, again, this question I asked earlier that fascinates me as a philosopher: what is it in the nature of things that leads there to be any science, right? As inquiring, curious minds, self-reflective, conscious beings, we're able to look back to the very origins of the universe, and we're able to imagine futures. And it seems that our type of consciousness is this space in which, as Brian was saying earlier, the universe can reflect upon itself. And so whatever kind of story we might want to tell about the origin of life, whatever kind of story we might want to tell about the origin of matter and energy in the cosmos, we're always implicitly presupposing mind there to witness that process, right? And so we're caught in this kind of strange loop. And as a philosopher, these are, for me, very interesting questions, all three of them. What is the origin of matter and the origin of the universe? What is the origin of life about? What is the origin of mind about? And they're all enfolded into each other in this kind of loopy way, as it were. And so when we, in a sense, what I'm inviting us to consider is that we can put mind back into the universe at the fundamental level, just like we can put life back into the universe at the most fundamental level, so that we can stop imagining scientific inquiry as something that our minds are imposing on nature from the outside. Science is something that the universe itself is doing in an effort to understand itself. So matter, life, mind, they're not these sealed compartments with these huge gaps where we need to, come up with some miraculous theoretical account of how you can get from dead matter to living organisms to self-reflective conscious scientists inquiring about the whole process. This is a continuous evolutionary journey. And there are major breakthroughs at different stages, but those breakthroughs are exemplifications of one creative process, such that the human being, each of us, alive today on this planet, is an exemplification of cosmic creativity, not an exception to cosmic creativity. Right? We're not anomalies in this universe. We are this universe trying to understand itself. So, to finish up here, one, I think, very concrete example of what it would look like to inhabit this new cosmos where mind and life are intrinsic expressions of the deepest dynamics of evolution is to think about love. Love, even in our secular, disenchanted civilization, is enchanting. We seek romantic love. We love our parents. We love our families, our children. Many of us in this room, I assume, love the natural world, at least the charismatic megafauna, if not the viruses. And so, love, I think we would all admit, is an essential aspect of human life. But I think over the last several hundred years, as our, modern Western culture has developed and been influenced by all of these scientific discoveries, we've become increasingly worried, right, about anthropomorphism. And so love has been reduced to a private emotion. Love has been reduced to, it's been shrunken into just a psychological thing. And we're embarrassed to imagine, many of us are embarrassed to imagine that love might have some cosmic significance. And I think it's that embarrassment that we really need to overcome if we want to step into this new worldview, so that we can recognize that love is not just a human emotion, that we in fact inherit our capacity for love and all of the other values, our interest in truth, our appreciation of beauty. We inherit these values from an evolutionary process and all the achievements of the various organisms which preceded us on life, that through a mix of cooperation and competition gave rise to the structure of our brain, gave rise to the structure of our eyes. We're inheriting all of that evolutionary energy and the achievements of these organisms. And our capacity to love one another has those deep roots, right? And so as the basis for a new civilization, imagining our human role is to become responsible for what we are inheriting. We don't make up value and then project it onto the world. We inherit value that's billions of years in the making, and we have a responsibility to carry that forward. So as much as all of what we're all saying today is grounded in the scientific evidence, it's a new way of relating to that scientific evidence that would be different, say, from Steven Weinberg, who famously said, the more the universe seems comprehensible, the more it seems pointless. Or, brilliant cosmologists and physicists. But that attitude, I think, needs to be overcome. Similarly, Richard Feynman, absolute genius, advanced quantum physics. He says, in his book on quantum electrodynamics, listen, nature is absurd. Don't try to understand. It doesn't make sense. And, there's a humility in some of the things that Feynman would say, like, he's a physicist and he's really interested and he's making discoveries. Clearly nature is intelligible or he wouldn't be able to make the discoveries he did. But he didn't think it had anything to do with human life. So he would say, look, just find something you love to do and do it. Nobody knows what's really going on in the universe. Don't worry about it. And I think these are just examples of scientific luminaries who I think have too small an imagination of the task at hand, which is to inherit not only the scientific evidence, but inherit the very spirit, which I think is a cosmic spirit of curiosity that allows there to be science in the first place. Why are we so curious about the nature of the universe? This quest for truth, I think, has deeper roots, and the quest for truth, I think, goes back to a common creative core of this universe that also includes the desire for beauty and for goodness, right? So it's not just a matter of we want to know the facts. We want to know the facts because we often find the proper organization of the facts where we get this aha moment. It's beautiful. And it's good in the sense that it gives us a sense of the value and meaning and purposes of our lives, that we can, as human beings, engage in a collaboration of lifelong learning and multi-generational learning. We need a new adventure to replace this old idea of capitalist technological progress and everything. We need a new adventure, a new vision of what our role is that's exciting to people. And I think what you're going to be hearing, what you've heard this morning and what you'll hear the rest of today is just a whole bunch of invitations and lures for you to follow and go out and talk to your friends and your family about, so that we can build this new worldview together. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm just going to get to ask a couple questions because I want to turn it to the audience. I'm sure they have a lot. So Matt, how old were you when you knew you wanted to be one of the most significant contemporary philosophers and do that for a living? I thought philosophy was really boring.
Is this on? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know the word philosophy until high school and had a very influential high school teacher that made me realize I wanted to be a teacher. But I think before I had the language for it, I was a 7-year-old. And I realized just one day, my perfectly healthy mother, she's still alive and healthy, I just realized she was going to die one day. And that threw me into this existential turmoil. And it took a few weeks for me to just get over that. And what did it for me was realizing that I was going to die and relating to my own consciousness as something that came into being and would eventually transform into something else. Just opened up this window onto my existence that I've never stopped peering through, and I think at this point I've climbed out the window. So,
So good. So you're part of a school that is really quite remarkable and unique, and it seems as though its whole being is around these questions. Can you talk a little bit about how this came to be and why?
Well, you're part of it too.
I am. Enthusiastic part of it.
Yeah, well, like each of us, I'm a product of this 13.8 billion year evolutionary process, but I'm also a product of about almost 17 years of study and deep immersion in community at this program at a graduate school in San Francisco, California Institute of Integral Studies, in the Philosophy, Cosmology, and Consciousness program, which was originally founded by Richard Tarnas, who you'll hear from later. Brian Swim taught there recently. They've both retired, and there's a whole new group of faculty. Jacob Sherman, who you'll hear from later today, is also on the faculty there. And it's a place to study philosophy, not just as the exploration of logical puzzles or academic questions that don't really have much to tell us about how to live a good, fulfilling human life, and to appreciate the living community that we're a part of. But rather, it's an approach to philosophy that both draws on this ancient tradition where loving wisdom, philosophia, is a way of life. It's a spiritual practice. It's not just for your head, it's for your heart, it's embodied, it's relational. And we're trying to engage philosophy really, and do philosophy in a time of planetary emergency. And so much of what we explore in the classroom, in addition to looking at the history of ideas, we want these ideas, we want to develop new ideas and help our students cultivate their own creativity to develop ideas that are relevant to the challenges that we're facing, politically, socially, culturally, the ecological crisis. And so it's a graduate program that's kind of an incubation for the creativity of the people that want to be a part of moving our species forward.
I just want to make a quick contrast. I spent a year as a fellow at Harvard as a graduate student, postgrad fellow, and comparing it to PCC. So one of the things happening in many of our universities is the specialization is so intense that scholars are asked, in the humanities to study one person 10 years of their life or a selection of their works. In sciences, it's so specialized. And what this means is a lot of our best minds are really not available to help solve the bigger problems. And I'm not sure what we're going to do about it, but this school is really founded on the idea. And I will tell you, it is a shitload of work to try to actually not be a specialist because you have to take in the entire Western tradition. But I do think this is really something we need so much right now if we're going to put our best brains against the biggest problems. Okay, now, questions for the audience. Matt, how do you account for the origination of mind and purpose of truth, beauty, and goodness in the cosmos and in us? That should be a pretty simple one.
Well, how do I account for it? It's quite literally not a countable thing. It's not a measurable thing. It's each of us has a feeling, many feelings. What are the origins of our own sense of purpose and meaning in life? We could do some anthropology and evolutionary biology and see how certain attractions and feelings of disgust that we have emerged at a certain point in the history of primates or animal life. But we have to keep pushing this question back and back and back. The first cell had this feeling of hunger, right? And where did that come from? Brian was describing the formation of stars in a very organic way, that our stellar ancestors are themselves hungry for energy and have a life cycle. They're born, they live, and they die, right? And so these values like truth and beauty and goodness are, admittedly, human ways of articulating the texture of value that I think goes all the way down. And traditionally, human beings have related to the source of these values, these cosmic organizing principles and attractors, you could say, that we're all sort of driven to know the truth and to feel beauty and to actualize goodness. Because there's something like spirit involved in nature. And I think in the modern period, we've tended towards more dualistic ways of understanding nature and spirit, which plays into the divide between science and religion. In the modern period, religion started to get the idea that what's described in its scriptures are scientific theories, and so they got all mixed up, and then scientists thought that they could come up with large-scale explanations for why we're here, solely based on the facts without doing any myth or anything, and so everybody got confused because of this dualism. And just as we're embarrassed to think of love as anything but a private emotion, a psychological experience that we have as human beings, maybe some mammals experience love, we're embarrassed about thinking of love as something that might be cosmic. I think we're also embarrassed about, some of us maybe it's not the case in this room, words like spirit. Maybe we all have a sort of, maybe a lot of us nowadays have a sort of vague spirituality. There's some sort of a something going on out there that we can't quite explain. It's a mystery. And I think that's that openness that I think more people are having nowadays who are not interested in traditional religious forms, I think is a good sign. The sociologists call this the spiritual but not religious crowd, right? But there's a new trend happening where it seems that approach to a sort of vague, nebulous spirituality is very easily co-opted by consumerism. And you get a sort of spiritual shopping mall where you can take a little bit of Buddhism here, a little bit of Taoism here, maybe some cosmic Christ, it's very non-committal, right? And traditionally, religion was about forming character. And often it took the form of having to assent to certain dogmas, which are just inherited ideas that communities have found to be transformative. And, I wouldn't want to suggest that we can return to anything like the way that, religion traditionally operated. But I think we do need to be a little bit less non-committal about our spirituality and recover ideas like spirit, the divine, and not think of that as in any way in conflict with science. Doesn't need to be in conflict with science. And so, the answer to the question, where does truth, beauty, and goodness come from? Why is the universe fine-tuned for life and consciousness? I can't do better than to say that there is some spiritual ground to our existence. And maybe that's satisfying to some of you, and maybe it's really dissatisfying to others, but as a philosopher, I have to admit that's as good as I can do.
Okay, from the audience, yes. You're going to have to shout.
I'm so glad you touched about the spirit, and I'm wondering if you're curious how it connects to the soul, which is individual but also universal, and the soul and intuition.
Okay, I got it. So, how does the spiritual connect to the soul, connect to intuition? Over to you. Yeah, that's a math question. I would say.
Don't you have a biochemistry question? Maybe we could. There's a German mystic named Meister Eckhart, who understood that the task of each of us as souls, as individuals, is to recognize that we are a womb. The soul is a womb, and that through our devotion, our love, not just for the divine, but for each other, for the whole of creation, we're actually giving birth to a new type of spirituality, but actually, he would say, giving birth to God in our souls, right? And so, we live in a very individualistic culture, and a very psychological culture. Everybody's in therapy, and we're really concerned with overcoming our complexes, and that's all very important, valuable work. But if we could reconnect to spirit, we can recognize that all of that psychological work, it's not just for you and your loved ones. The whole universe needs human beings to give birth to a new type of spirit, right? Spirit might be the origin, but it's also a kind of destiny that it's not determined that we're going to realize that. But I think human beings have an evolutionary purpose. And you could even say, maybe we're not fully human yet. We have this idea of what it might be, what it might mean to be human, having something to do maybe with wisdom and compassion. And we're striving for that, and the soul is the womb wherein that new type of wise and compassionate consciousness might be born. And that would be spirit.
I just want to say really quickly, I think Carl Jung is a fantastic resource for that question. He was very consciously aware that we cannot go exactly back to the traditional religions at this point, and we're kind of stuck right now. And his thought was that the connection we have to our soul and to the universal is through our unconscious, through our dreams, our active imagination. And I think psychedelic altered states of consciousness, if used carefully, breath, breathing, I think there have been tools over the last century developed, understanding that for the moment we're a little on our own in a social, cultural sense until the next way of articulating this comes forward. One more question. And yes, you and the blue shirt. Well, is it a blue shirt?
Yes.
Yes, okay.
The universe seems to be very interested in complexity.
Great question. Is that it?
No, it's not.
That's a good
The
question.
question is, does this complexity, we have found out that for us to survive, we need to be conscious of love and the experience of a civilization. But does the universe, in its interest in complexity, does it have a moral element, or is it just trying out any damn thing it wants?
Okay, I'm going to try this. the universe is interested in complexity, and the question is, in these values that we feel, right, these moral values, is this something very central, or is this just kind of improv from the universe? Is that the essence of the question?
Yes, and the universe doesn't really care about us, it's just trying out
It's just-
anything and everything.
It's a jazz musician, right?
Yes.
Okay. I think that's you, Matt. You gotta go with that one again.
Hopefully Bruce can help here. But, you know, it's clear all the traditional religions have this problem called theodicy. Theodicy being, how do you explain evil? If God's all good, why so much evil? Why so much strife? And I think science has revealed a lot to us about why cataclysm and destruction and death are essential aspects of the evolutionary process. Death is not an accidental part of life. It's essential to life, right? And so I tend to think that it's not so much that the universe is driven by some sense of morality, because, you know, different human societies have different senses of what's moral and what's immoral. And morality has evolved over the course of human history. And so it would be, I think, anthropomorphic to project a particular sense of the moral onto the cosmic. However, I think we can recognize that the universe, if it is driven in some sense, if there's an aim, I think it would be more of an aesthetic aim. It's an aim at the intensity of experience, and this is where complexity comes in. The more complex that matter and energy can organize itself, I think, especially, you know, if you're not sure if atoms and stars have some inner experiential aspect to them. Let's just begin with cells. From a simple cell to, you know, all the species of fungi and plants and animals and human beings, it seems like this process of complexification of our physiology has deepened the intensity of our experience, which both means we can feel more pain, but also beauty. And if you just were to understand the evolution of life as a survival of the fittest, where the goal is to become a species that can survive longer and reproduce more, I don't think we would have expected organisms to become comparatively deficient in survival power. Because often more complexity does not mean you're better at surviving. You're much more fragile. Human beings are quite fragile, but we're more sensitive to this aesthetic intensity, right? And so if I were to say, if you were to ask, you know, what is the aim of the universe, I would say it's not so much moral, it's not immoral, it's kind of amoral. The universe is not seeking just to, you know, be a good boy or a good girl. It's seeking to enhance and intensify its experience of beauty.